Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm your moderator, Charlene O'Hanlon, and I welcome you to today's event. We have a really interesting webinar with hopefully some really compelling discussion on tap, but before we get started with that, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the discussion, just know you'll be able to access the webinar on demand later on. We'll be sending out a link to the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience, so at any time during today's event, if you have a question for any of our panelists, just use your GoToWebinar control panel, submit your question, and hopefully we'll have a few minutes near the end of the event to go over those audience questions. Okay, with that, we'll go ahead and get started on today's webinar, Databases, the Neglected Technology in DevOps, a panel discussion. Next slide, Ben. Our panelists today, we've got a really great lineup. Our panelists today are Adam Bowen, who's with the Office of the CTO at Delphix, Sanjay Challa, who is Senior Product Marketing Manager at Datical, and Chris Chirillo, who's Director of Product Marketing at InfluxDB. Hey guys, welcome. Thanks for joining me.
Hey,
Hello.
good to be on.
All right, hail, the gang's all here. All right. Well, today's discussion is, Ben, next slide, please, is based on an ebook, based in part on an ebook that DevOps.com has just published. It's now available for download on DevOps.com. And attendees of today's webinar will also be receiving a copy via a download link, which will be emailed also following the webinar. So the ebook is called How DevOps Can and Should Unlock the Database's Potential. So good stuff there, good stuff there. But so today's discussion is going to focus a lot on what was in that ebook, what is in that ebook, and hopefully we'll be able to expand on some of the points a little bit more. So guys, let's go ahead and kick off today's webinar. Ben, if you could move on to the next slide, please. Today's webinar with, I guess the simple question, which is why? Why are DevOps and databases kind of not meeting in the middle? We've seen success with DevOps in other areas, even extending out to the mainframe, but databases kind of seems to be that, forgotten child, if you will, and especially since a lot of the, the processes that are involved in application development for databases is very similar. So, what's holding it back? Why haven't enterprises adopted DevOps for databases as much as they have for other areas of application development? I'll just throw it out there and let whoever go ahead.
Yeah, this is Sanjay. I mean, that's a great question, and a big part of this has to do with the role that data has in the enterprise. Adam here will probably talk about it in a minute because it's a big part of how Delphix also sees the world, kind of this aspect of data gravity. But data is one of the most important assets that the enterprise has. And for a long time, in order to properly safeguard, protect, and manage this invaluable asset, teams and processes and silos were created. And what's happened is, as the world has changed and as Agile and DevOps have come about, the database has gotten left behind, in part because there's so much fear around what happens if something should go wrong to the database. And so that has certainly left the database behind. And unlike all other aspects of the software stack, what's unique about the database is it has state. And what that means is if you mess something up in application code land, you simply make a fix and you can overwrite the broken version with the new version and happily move on with life. Well, with the database, that doesn't work that way. If you break the database, you're in a lot of trouble and there's a lot more work. You can't just overwrite your existing database. It contains all the state, it contains all these records. And so in that sense, the stakes are a lot higher with the database. And so these are some of the reasons why the database has gotten left behind. This whole concept of move fast and break things, that the likes of Facebook and others have really championed. Works great on application code, completely falls apart when it comes to the database. You want to?
Hmm.
Well, as Sanjay said, I do very much see the world in the same manner. This is Adam from Delphix, by the way, because you've not heard my voice yet. But we definitely do see that in the same way. And part of the problem is with these, especially when you start talking about large systems of record, especially I know we'll probably talk about Kubernetes and microservices because it's all the buzz these days, and I'm a big fan of those things. But it's all about make the applications destroyable, don't hold any pertinent information in there, something that just can't be blown away or can't be instantly handled by 17 other things. Well, as you mentioned, state has then been pushed even more critically into things like the database and some other mechanisms. So the constraints have just been moved there. And following the DevOps kind of guiding principles, the theory of constraints, simply states that unless you're actually addressing the immediate constraint, all you're actually doing is deceiving yourself because you're actually queuing up work or starving systems for work elsewhere. And that's what we've been doing for data. And unfortunately, because also we combine that with the fact that our database engineers and administrators have kind of been late to the party, either by their own willingness or because others have excluded them, that makes the constraint even worse because they're not ready to start thinking about cross-functional teams and goal-oriented teams and things that get the job handled. So it's a people, process, and technology conundrum that we're now facing of critical proportions.
I agree, and I also disagree. And I think it's just a matter of definition. So when I think about like the big, giant, massive databases that hold all that mission critical data, I think I agree with what you guys are saying with those kinds of databases. And I think we were kind of brought up as engineers to always solve how to get that data into the reports or into the UI, whatever way we could from the application side. We were just naturally been doing that for years and years and years. I mean, I was always deathly afraid of our like big database architect guy. I never wanted to screw around with the stuff that he built. So I completely agree with you. We've just naturally come to that point where we're still not going to mess around with that because nobody wants to destroy that because it is really important data. But I also think there are other databases that are also used quite a bit in our applications that I feel like have kind of like gone into our agile processes. I mean, if I think about so we have a hosted version of our database offering. And so if I think about all the different databases that we actually interact with in our application, there are databases that hold like the credit card processing information that are, actually owned by a third-party SaaS. We use Salesforce as like the system of record for the sales team, and then we also have a different system for the system of record for support purposes. So I feel like some of these other, I don't know if I should say smaller or just maybe very purpose-built intentional databases that aren't just holding that really awesome juicy data that really drives our business. I feel like these other smaller databases, we've been able to work with them in an agile fashion. The big one, absolutely, I agree with everything that you guys have said.
Well, and I mean, just to make things really clear, though, when we are talking about whether it's things like Salesforce or database as a service or hosted services, there's work there. It's often that it's not your organization that has to deal with making that database move fast. And so I don't, I guess just because it's not your application teams or DBA teams that are suffering with keeping Salesforce.com online or taking advantage of a database as a service or some other SaaS offering. I don't want people to get the idea that going to cloud or going to hosted services makes the problem go away. It's just that someone else is dealing with that problem. There is a very real issue around adding new capabilities and enhancements that require DDL, DML, kind of structural or logic changes to the database. How do you make that in an agile fashion when you have fundamentally a system that is not very good at handling errors, not very good at being broken? You can't overwrite it. So someone's got to pay that tax somewhere. Effectively, is kind of the comment.
Okay, Sanjay, you made a point earlier with one of the reasons is because a lot of the mission critical information is running on these databases. But yeah, I kind of heard the same argument with mainframes, and now we're starting to see a lot more movement in that space. So what's different or what's changed? What is, where's that thinking going?
I don't think, well, I'm not sure I fully understand. There are certainly companies to this day that still have everything that ultimately ends up in a mainframe, and there's a ton of ETL, and for people who are kind of new to this, the export, transform, load, it's kind of ways to move data around that gets data out of mainframes into relational databases and sometimes all the way back. I guess that's kind of missing the point, though. And one of our observations as we've gone to market and learned from a lot of different prospects and customers out there is that there was a day and age in which you would release once or twice a year. And those are really major events. Everyone was up. The entire weekend was spent on go live and troubleshooting whatever errors happened during go live. It was a really, really major event. It was a weekend away from the family. Mm-hmm. And what's happened is, with these changes in the way that software is being delivered, at least on the application code side, things are starting to move a lot faster. People are adopting, 3-week sprints, 2-week sprints. You have application code shipping faster than ever before. One of the things that we found is increasingly the database has become the bottleneck. And there was a third-party market survey done with 300 kind of Fortune 1000 companies. And what was remarkable is what a strong correlation there was between the frequency of application releases and the extent to which database releases were a challenge. And effectively, if you're just releasing once or twice a year, yeah, okay, you can kind of take one for the team and there's a really major event. When you're releasing, once a month, when you're releasing every 2 weeks, the database is a really, really major bottleneck if it's still this manual siloed process of involving a team of DBAs to review every change, to kind of make these changes effectively out of band. You have an entirely separate pathway for database code to get from development to production. And that simply doesn't scale. You can't throw enough warm bodies at it. And eventually it kind of brings down all of these other efficiencies that you're trying to work to achieve across your software lifecycle. And so it's kind of a discovery backed by some research that the pain only gets worse the faster your application release cycles get.
Which is a perfect seg into our next slide, which is the quote that you have in the ebook that the faster organizations try to go, the more difficult this whole database deployment challenge gets. So obviously you've been talking about that, but what is there anything else that when we're thinking about the speed at which organizations do run, is there any way that they can kind of mitigate that issue with with the databases specifically? And then I'd also like to hear what the other panelists have to say about that quote.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think our take on it is you really need to bring DevOps to the entire software stack. And just like Adam was saying, the theory of constraints, you can't just shove the problem to the database team, wash your hands clean and walk away. You have to take a step back and recognize that a functional end user experience involves the application code and the database code. And frankly, it involves more than that, but we treat everything else as code. We treat infrastructure as code. We treat networking as code. We treat app code as code. And the extent to which we don't bring the database into this party and treat the entire software stack, including the database, with the kind of the same methodologies, it's a disservice. You're not going to get any faster. And so that's kind of the unique insight is you got to bring the database to the party as well.
So I think, and I agree with Sanjay, and also I'll echo back. I agree with what Chris said earlier, right? And kind of the general premise is, hey, for our smaller databases, we've been doing that for a while, because the problem is in itself the database. It's the data, and everything hinges around the data. And data's never been more strategic, to echo what Sanjay was getting to, and it's never been harder to manage and protect at the same time. There's an unprecedented thirst for data that's not being met, and ultimately that's stifling the speed of innovation and ultimately the speed of business. And the culprit, when I talk about this, is data friction, which is caused in part by the massive explosion in the amount of data in silos all over your organizations and locked down in an inadequate attempt to protect and secure data. And if you've never heard this term or heard me use this term of data friction before, it's simple. Data friction is caused when constraints on data prevent people from meeting the ever-growing demands of the business, or as I like to put it, anywhere you feel heat or pain where data is involved. And we're all in a race to win. And just like in a Formula One race, the difference between first and losing usually boils down to having friction where it counts and eliminating it everywhere else. And so when you start thinking about this, it's easy. Like, I don't have a data masking problem because I only have 5 tables of data and 500 rows. That's like saying, you know what, I can ship application every day because I only have 1,000 lines of code. But the bigger it gets and the more complex systems you have, because let's remember, it's never as simple as I have a database in an application. It's I have a series of applications that rely on a series of data sources that all need to be synchronized together. And if I move one or change one thing, I have to be sure it doesn't break everything else with all the simultaneous changes, because I have 5 different application teams developing on 5 different systems of record, and I need to make sure they move fast. So a developer might be able to make a lot of changes quickly in his environment because it works in his or her environment or his or her container. But once it gets down to actual functional and integration testing and things like that, guess what? It all comes to a screeching halt, and it really slows down, and that's where the problems start to really culminate.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And, I always, when I think of like what makes us unique, every company that I've been in, it's always been like the data, right, that we can bring to the application, to the users, because then they can get some kind of insight out of it and do something, fabulous with it. But then, how do we find the uniqueness of our data? And it's not, just like you described, it's not like it was laid out that way to begin with. It's like over time we start to realize, oh, the combination of this data with that data is actually what's really interesting. So let's bring that to the table. So all of a sudden we have these crazy, a whole bunch of different databases joined together in ways that we had never even thought of in the beginning. And so it's this huge, thing that we're carrying with us to the future. And you're right, it's very difficult to then, make any kind of a change.
All right, great. Well, let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. In the ebook, I think it was Datical. Sanjay, I think your organization talked about just a quick database checklist for bringing DevOps to the table, basically, and that includes the automation and then the ability to track the deployment status of database changes, visibility and ownership of the pipeline by DevOps. Can you guys maybe just discuss each one real quickly and talk about how how each one is important to the process as a whole?
Yeah, no problem whatsoever. The funny thing about this is bringing DevOps to the database is not all that different from bringing DevOps to any other part of the software stack. And when you look at the kind of the tenets that underlie Agile and kind of DevOps methodologies, it's all about breaking down silos and increasing transparency. It's all about amplifying feedback loops, enabling kind of self-service and rapid feedback. It's all about making really small iterative changes that are kind of in source code control that you can trace. And really, when you look at the database, we're saying all of those same things. It's about bringing automation in to validate incoming database code immediately, so it doesn't have to go through this kind of painfully long manual review process. That in turn enables like developer self-service. It's about creating a system where you're checking stuff into source code control and kind of making small iterative changes that are very specific. More than anything, it's about enabling a team to kind of control their destiny, right? And when you kind of hear the guys at Amazon talk about it, it's you build it, you run it. And a big part of that means, as a team that's responsible for a service, be it a microservice or an entire app or whatever it is, you got to own the entire stack. And you can't be lobbing stuff over the fence. You can't be in the dark about where a specific database change is or isn't. And so, quite simply, it's bringing all of the same, wonderful stuff that's been brought to application code to bear on the database. The only kind of constraint here is the database is a little bit different from the app in the sense that you have to be much more careful about evolving the state of the database in a way that doesn't break it. And that's where there is some kind of uniqueness around how you validate database code, the precautions you take before you go deploy database code. But outside of that, the core concepts are all the same.
All right, great. Anybody have anything to add to that?
I think the only thing that I would add, and it's just because of the nature of the company that we're at, is also just to add on to the automation is, monitoring and logging as well, and making that, giving visibility to the teams, on that as well, so that they can understand. Because you're right. I mean, we have to look at the entire stack in order to understand, like, where are things, bogging down, where are there some kind of user experience issues, and so making sure that people who are involved in, building of the application can see in its entirety, how things are doing from a monitoring perspective, a performance perspective. I think it's now everybody's responsibility, and not just, the DBAs are just responsible for that portion. Everybody needs to have visibility into it.
Okay.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah.
Awesome. All right, great. So, so one of the things, next slide, please, that was brought up in the book also was this concept of data ops. And Adam, I know your cohort, Patrick Lightbody, actually spoke at length in the ebook about it. So I wonder if you can kind of take the lead on telling us about the concept of data ops and how it can kind of help along the process.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. This is something that's near and dear to my heart, and me, Patrick, and a few others at Delphix gave this a long thought a while back. And so for some of you on there today, it's like, oh, I've heard about data ops. It's about analytics. And you know what? Yes, that is true. There is a lens of data ops that applies to analytics and in that space. But really, data ops is much bigger than analytics. It's even much bigger than software development lifecycle. Data ops, it's the alignment of people, process, and technology. You've heard me say that several times, I'm sure, to enable the rapid, automated, and secure management of data. And the goal of data ops is to improve outcomes by bringing together those that need data with those that provide it, eliminating friction throughout the data lifecycle. Ultimately, if I kind of saved, because I knew we'd talk about data ops next, the only other thing I would add kind of to the previous slide there, that there's nothing wrong with it, but is the biggest part of it is that there's a big culture divide. There is the DevOps team, and which might even include people from ops, and then there's the DBAs. And you brought up a great point earlier, Cheryl, about the mainframe people. There's nobody that has a more unique, distinct, separate culture from everybody else in the company than the mainframe people. Why? Because they've probably been there longer than most of the other teams. Their technology hasn't been replaced, so they've had this longevity. There's a whole different divide. They're usually, from a age perspective, they're much older. They have much more seniority. And who's second next to that are the DBAs of these of these Oracle systems, of these Microsoft SQL systems. And so there's something to be said about a big cultural gap between their willingness to adopt these things. So why am I talking about all this? Because data ops, just from a DevOps perspective, it focuses on the same kind of applications of people, process, and technology, but across a whole data ecosystem. So it's not just about where DevOps is focused on delivering product, getting value out of product as quickly as possible into the hands of the consumers with fast feedback loops. Data ops is about the SDLC, it's about analytics, it's about machine learning, it's about AI, it's about data privacy concerns, and it's about how do you eliminate the barriers between people that do this. And sometimes it's technology. We all need tools. Like we're all, all three of your panelists here work for software companies, so none of us would say that you don't need product to make it happen. But unless you actually break down the processes that are constraining these organizations or these people to actually get at the heart of the problem, then you're not actually going to be able to move any faster. Again, you're just moving the constraint, because you need that 30-year-old DBA with his expertise to be part of your goal-oriented team, to understand the value to the customer and to focus on driving like the performance or driving to those metrics that you need in order to, take your company to the next level. What you don't need is you don't need him spending 37 hours on a weekend, making copies for somebody or troubleshooting, a failed deployment or, doing these other things. So DataOps is about how do you actually improve the system as a whole and look at it holistically rather than just trying to solve it with tools or more bodies, as Sanjay said earlier. So it's really kind of a general practice.
Okay, great. Does anybody have anything they would like to add on that whole concept? Okay, well then we'll just
Adam got it pretty well there.
Awesome. Well, then let's go ahead and move on to our next slide, please. And I think, Adam, you mentioned earlier how you're a big fan of Kubernetes and microservices, and obviously they are becoming a lot more established as go-to technologies. But I don't think there's been much discussion around how they actually impact databases. Actually, I'm going to ask Chris, because you actually talk about this in the book. You said there are many issues associated with building databases for Kubernetes platforms. So I'm wondering if you can expand on that, and then I invite the other panelists to go ahead and speak as well.
I think it was Adam that was talking in the beginning about, databases, they have a unique state. And if you think about Kubernetes or containers, the whole idea is that you want to be able to bring these things up, right? And then you can toss them away really quick, right? It's up and down, it's very ephemeral. But, databases, it's not that easy to just bring them up and down at a moment's notice, right? There's just a lot more coordination that has to happen. And so I just think it just seems to be a natural conflict with orchestrating with things like Kubernetes.
Okay, you guys have anything you want to?
Yep.
Any
rebuttals? So this is Adam. I agree. Like, there's significant challenges with that, and that's what I find today when I go in to speak to, from a Delphix, from where like we kind of stand is we talk to Fortune 500 customers that have huge databases, and guess what? They want to adopt. They want to be hip and they want to be cool. They want to go Kubernetes. They want to go microservices. But then they're like, that doesn't really sync very well with my large systems of record, which is really where the source of the problem is, right? These large monolithic databases. And while that's true, I think, what we're seeing is, and I think that Kubernetes and microservices are leading the way, and it's bringing the data friction to a point of where people have to start dealing with it. Where now, if you look in from a thought leadership perspective, you start looking at things of, I call it, turning the elephant into fleas, where people are trying to take these big systems of record and they're trying to turn it into a bunch of discrete atomic data sources that handle just specific things. And so now, instead of having one, I'll just make it easy for math, but instead of having, one 10,000, record database, now you have 10 1,000 record databases. Of course, we know, it's millions of records and orders of magnitude more. Where these databases are becoming, where they can be more ephemeral and they can kind of have, share state across these multiple environments. I don't think the technology is quite there yet, but I definitely see a lot of work going on in those fields. But the truth of the matter is, as today, is that we have to figure out a way to, in order for these microservices and Kubernetes, which I think is going to, by the way, become like kind of the default platform going forward. John Willis recently made this proclamation at London DevOps Enterprise Summit, and I agree with him. But as Kubernetes microservices become the standard platform of how we go forward, we're going to have to figure out how to work with these large systems of record today and how to effectively use those, but then also, what does that mean for the future? Because I don't think they can exist in their current state. It's not compatible with where we're going in the future. Yeah,
and this is Sanjay. I think just to add to that, we also work with Fortune 500s, and one of the funny things is, as they look to some of these new platforms, as they look to microservices and cloud, this is also part of what makes kind of that database problem worse, because now you're going from your one giant monolithic database, which you already had a hard time making updates to and kind of moving along, to, a order of magnitude more databases, because every, microservice now has its own little data store behind it, that are kind of deployed oftentimes all over the globe, and you've had to do some very creative things around sharding and kind of managing these data sets. And so if you're still kind of powering your entire database release process with manual effort, it simply doesn't scale. It will fall apart when you go to cloud and microservices, because there's just no number of human bodies that you can throw at keeping all these things in sync and deploying coherently to them. You're kind of asking for trouble. And so we often get pulled in where people realize, oh man, I got to manage an order of magnitude more database instances. I got to do so much more to keep them in sync. I need to do a better job of tracking database changes against application changes, because that's kind of the point of being agile, is I need to get a feature out the door quickly, or I need to defer this feature. And any of that kind of business requirement change or logic that you want to accommodate, especially when you go to cloud and microservices, becomes near impossible if you haven't brought DevOps and that agility to the database as well. And you know, again, I agree that there are so many benefits to kind of the cloud microservices delivery model. I don't see people not going there, but people are certainly going to get very stuck getting there if they don't think about solving kind of the data constraints and kind of the database release issues on their path there.
All right, great. Well, we've actually gotten some really interesting questions on this particular topic, which I'm going to hold on to for now. But our next topic, if we could have the next slide, please, is security. Everybody talks about it. It's critical. It's critical for databases. It's critical for everything. And when it comes to databases, I'm sure that there are certain security implications that need to be addressed, and especially, as possibly as we do move down toward down the path of microservices. So, I'd like to just kind of throw it out to you guys. What are some of the things that are specific to databases when it comes to security that we really need to keep in mind?
So this is Sanjay. I can kind of start a short list, and maybe the folks here can pile on with their thoughts. Some of the things that we find are how database credentials themselves are managed. I'd be a rich guy if I counted the number of times I've heard a prospect talk about how, well, yeah, there are a couple of DBAs who have the schema, who are the schema owners and have the password, and oh, by the way, it's on a sticky note pasted up to their monitor because that's how we do it. So everything from how just credentials to access different schemas are managed, all the way out to the kind of permissions and grants that you have in lower level environments that are often unchecked on their way to higher level environments. These all pose pretty major security threats because you open yourself up to data breach or just really data mishandling that can be disastrous, not just from a downtime, but from a data theft point of view. So, when it's looking at these security concerns, again, it sounds like beating a dead horse here, but it's bringing a lot of the same best practices that exist in other places. It's about automating some of the reconciliation of all of your kind of security policies to database changes as they move forward. It's about using credential vaults or other systems to manage access to these database systems, having role-based access control baked in. It all sounds really basic, but it's still surprising how, when you have hands on keyboard in terms of keeping databases up and moving, how a lot of this stuff, even if people know it well, isn't implemented. It's kind of a process challenge that needs to be overcome. Those are some of the highlights that we see.
So, from my perspective, so one of the biggest challenges at Delphix we look at from another angle, though not a different lens, but we have a different kind of perspective on how we help our customers with security perspective. And that's, if you look at the data across your entire estates at these companies, 90% of your data is actually in non-prod environments. And I won't ask for a raise of virtual hands on this webinar, but I assure you, if everybody's being honest, and I was asked who has actual production or sensitive information in their non-production environments, a good portion of you, if not maybe all of you, would raise your hand, right? And the fact of the matter is non-production is not secured like production. It never will be. There'll never be the money spent there. And when we go to the cloud, since I work in the Fortune 500, I could name names, and I would surely be in a lot of trouble. But there's a lot of very well-known organizations that are running production data in unprotected environments or non-production environments. So from Delphix, we look at actually making sure that data is delivered masked automatically to the teams that need it. So if your developers or QA analysts or whomever, your non-production users, when they request or get data themselves via self-service, the data is automatically masked, and it's already masked according to company policy, and you can check that. So our kind of approach is that doesn't obviously protect production, which is important, but it makes sure that all your lower environments, that 90% of where data resides, is actually free and clear, that in the event there was a breach or in the event somebody's system was hacked or firewall was penetrated or something was left open, that the data they gather is garbage. So you might have to worry about a breach being there, but you don't have to worry about sending a report out and saying, oh, by the way, we lost 1 million social security numbers or what have you in that perspective. So making sure that you never use sensitive data anywhere where it's not absolutely required is critical to making sure that you're not on the front page of the news.
I think you're absolutely right. I think we've all been there, right? It's not just like, all the other environments, but also backups as well, right? I mean, how are those things treated? I feel like a lot of times it's also about education. So in a number of organizations that I've been at, we actually have had security experts come in and just we would get a week training from them and give it to everybody, the DBAs, the engineers, the sysadmins, everybody, and just they would just explain, what might seem obvious on the surface, but sometimes when you don't really explain to people that, hey, we need to be careful with, just giving data to anybody, or we have to be careful with, using that sticky note for a password, it really is about just educating people as well as putting in all those processes, because then, we have to make sure that security is also responsibility of the individual. We need them to think as well, so they don't do some of these things, and it's usually accidental, right? Or they're just in a hurry. I don't feel like any of the employees are really trying to be malicious about it, but we can't expect them to just naturally know these things. We do need to go out of their way to also educate them on what it means to be secure, in the entire stack.
DevOps is about culture, automation, learning, monitoring, and sharing, right? The great acronym CALMS. And part of that goes back to earlier when I was talking about data friction. Remember, like I said, even though data is more strategic today, it's never been more difficult to manage, which we've talked a good portion about that, but also to secure. And it's never been more critical, like in terms of dollars if you're a company, or potential loss of human life in some extreme circumstances, for data to be secure. We got GDPR, and we've got a lot of other things going across the globe, and things are becoming very, very unsettling. And security is a huge part of data friction, because in order to move fast, like everybody's already waiting on that copy forever. Now, if it has to be masked, right, we know that it's a long, hard process. Even if you say if you're using Oracle and you have Oracle's tool to mask it. Well, that's, like I said, it's never as simple as one database. It's usually multiple. So now you have to get the Microsoft SQL team or whatever to give you a copy of their masked database and get everything in concert together. It needs to be masked from the same point in time, and it needs to have referential integrity. And so this actually is a huge constraint that escalates things. So what just happens in the end? Well, we'll just be really careful, and we haven't been compromised yet. So we'll just be really careful, and we'll address that later once we get all these other things solved. And one by one, these become, tomorrow's headlines.
Yeah, and it's also, oh, by the way, you get a refresh of fraud data, twice a year. That's it, because that's all we can afford to do, given the cycle time.
Okay. All right. Well, I know we probably could do an entire webinar on security and databases and DevOps. And so I do want to go ahead and move ahead because I want to make sure that we talk, next slide, please, talk about the tools that you guys, your companies offer that, hopefully make a database and DevOps kind of meet in the middle, as it were, and kind of help the process along. So Sanjay, why don't I go ahead and let you tell us a little bit about what Datical has that can help this.
Absolutely. And, I think before I jump too far into what Datical does, it's worth stating that when you're trying to bring DevOps to the database, it's really about unifying your software delivery, and it's not about inventing an entirely new set of methodologies and processes to get database code from dev to prod. It's really about leveraging the existing infrastructure and tools that have been put in place for moving application code from dev to prod and bringing the database in. And that's really the perspective that Datical takes. And so what are kind of the usual suspects in this? You're going to have some kind of source code control system. You're probably already using one for your application code. Great, you get to start checking in database scripts into that. The next becomes you have some kind of CI tool. Whether it's Jenkins, whether it's Bamboo, whether it's whatever it is, there are so many different kind of CI tools out there. You're going to still have that orchestrate both checking out and validating application code as part of your build process, but that's where Datical plugs in as well. It gets called by the CI tool as well, and automates the validation of database code. Next, again, usual culprit is you'll have some kind of artifact repository, whether it's JFrog, whether it's Nexus, Sonatype, because out of your build process, you get some kind of immutable artifact that you can consistently and repeatedly deploy. Next, you have your application release automation tool. It's your ZB Labs, it's your IBM Urban Code, heck, you can even use Jenkins. There's so many different ways to, again, solve that problem, but you're going to have some kind of thing to help orchestrate these releases. And instead of just doing it for the application code, again, here's where Datical gets involved, and these tools can take these artifacts out of the artifact repository and use Datical to help manage the database piece of it, but your entire software stack is kind of orchestrated with release orchestration tools all the way out. And then, of course, you have monitoring tools that help you understand the health of the system. That's, it's not a point solution. It's not a separate solution. It's about a unified picture for your entire software stack. And that's really what it takes to make, DevOps happen for the database. Let these guys chime in as well.
Great, excellent. All right, well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, Cheryl, go ahead.
Okay, all right. Chris, why don't you tell us a little bit about what InfluxData's got?
Yeah, so we are basically 4 open source projects, and our key project is a time series database. And you use a time series database to store timestamp data, which is really useful for trying to understand the state of anything. So whether it's the state of your servers or your databases, your microservices, that's why you need to have a time series database. It's optimized for time, so you don't have to worry about that. It's already indexed for time. We also do a number of things like because when you're collecting timestamp data, it's typically a lot of data coming in because you can set it to various intervals. Like a lot of the microservices will be set to a millisecond interval. So all of a sudden you have a lot of data coming in. So we do some compaction as well as allow you to set retention policies so you can drop data as you need to. The thing that is cool about this technology is that it's not. I've seen so many clever use cases with our product. So there's the obvious use case where you might want to just use it for just your basic DevOps kind of monitoring. So you can track the state of your servers or your microservices or whatever it is, your application or very specific functions within your applications. But we also have a lot of people that actually use it to actually help provide some visibility into their applications that they offer to their customers. So we have customers that are in the IoT space that will actually monitor, like battery performance, and I'm talking about like these big batteries that are actually getting their energy fed from a solar panel. So you just want to be able to understand, how much data or how much energy is being collected, how fast is it being collected, and some of these can be indicators of whether the battery is going to start to fail or things could go wrong. So a lot of really cool use cases. I think the other thing that's really interesting is as an open source project, I feel like a lot of developers, feel that they can be really creative with the use of InfluxDB, and so we see actually really great adoption within organizations. It's really simple for anybody who's managing any part of the stack to be able to introduce this and have people start using it, and also have people start sharing the data that's being collected to help with the monitoring of the entire stack. So it's really easy for Scrum masters to be able to ask the teams to start monitoring the code that they're putting in. And especially, it's especially important when you think about if we're trying to get to these really quick release cycles, you're introducing a ton of change into the system. And so by being able to monitor how those things that you've changed is impacting the system becomes really important for you to be able to prove to the team that, hey, the stuff that I put in, it's going to be fine. I've got this way of monitoring, the performance of it. And if it's not, at least we know it's this little portion of the code that's impacted. So yeah, here's a picture of our 4 open source projects. You can see InfluxDB is in the center, so that's the time series database. You could just use that on its own, and we actually have a lot of people that only use InfluxDB. But we also do have a set of collector agents called Telegraph, where you could use to pipe data into InfluxDB. We also have a number of client libraries that a lot of people like to use, like Java, JavaScript, Go, etc. So this is where people are actually collecting metrics on the little functions that they're writing, or if they've had the luxury of being able to go to more of a microservices architecture, they can also feed that kind of stuff using their favorite language. And then chronograph is just basically the UI, so you can just take a look at what you've actually piped into InfluxDB, and then capacitor is just basically a data processing engine. So a lot of people use that to take the data out of InfluxDB and use it for machine learning, or use it to feed into their favorite alerting framework, so like an Ops GME, VictorOps, Alerta, PagerDuty, etc., to then inform people of when things are just kind of misbehaving.
Okay, great. Adam, why don't you tell us a little bit about what your company has?
Sure.
Moving along here.
Of more Influx slides there.
Yeah, more Influx slides. Yeah, we'll move on to, there we go. Okay.
All right, great. And sure, I will keep this kind of brief to the point. And for anybody who wants to learn more about Delphix, our technology is really slick. A lot of people use it. If you go to my blog at adam.today, you can actually go to blog, have videos using Delphix and an SDLC, what that looks like. Datical is in the mix too, because I think it's a chocolate and peanut butter story. People who love Delphix love Datical, and the other way around. But Delphix believes that data should flow securely, freely, and at lower cost, eliminating the friction around data. Next slide, Ben, please. We accomplish this by providing secure, self-service, and automated access to data, accelerating workflows for developers, testers, and AI analysts, wherever they need it, on premises, in the cloud. We believe that we have to eliminate the data friction for both sides. If you look at a lot of tools today, where's the constraint? I have Jenkins and I can automate building infrastructure and code, but everything's left out except for like the database side. That does nothing but increase friction. If I can give your database administrators might say to that, you know what? I can create copies quickly, or I can secure, we have tools to secure our data. And it's usually an Oracle guy saying that, and the Microsoft SQL guy will say the same thing. They're not the same type of tools. But then at the other side, the people who actually need the data, which are your developers, analysts, and whomever, they don't see the benefit of that tool, because at the end of the day, it's whenever the DBA gets around to it after the ticket's submitted. So friction still exists, and we believe in eliminating the friction simultaneously for both groups, and that's how to move things forward. Next slide, please, Ben. And we do this through this concept called data pods, which allows developers and QA people or testers to be able to have self-service access to data, being able to click of a button, being able to refresh a complete entire environment with mass data from the latest version available. And it's also available to be integrated via APIs. Again, go to my blog, you'll see this in action and more detail on the technology. And last slide, Ben, I think we have one more. And as a result, hundreds of the largest companies and most valuable brands in the world are accelerating their business through faster, higher quality, and more insightful releases of software. And at Delphix, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to not necessarily make DBA's lives easier in a singularity. We're trying to help businesses accelerate their value, because at the end, if your business is exceeding, their products are getting in the hands of their customers, and the customers are happier, more satisfied, buying more product, then that's a tide that lifts all boats. that even the DBAs, the developers, all the way up to the CEO can benefit from. And that in the end is our goal.
All right. All right, great. Well, thanks guys for providing that information on your companies. Good stuff there. And that gives us about 10 minutes to go over audience questions. We have gotten some really great questions in so far, but want to remind the audience, if you do have a question, just use your GoToWebinar control panel. Submit your question, and hopefully we'll have time to get to all of them. Let's go ahead and dive right on in. The first question is, let's see, regarding everything being treated as something as code. Everything looks like a nail if your only tool is a hammer. Is treating database as code the right thing to do? Just because this works well with other things doesn't mean it's true for DB. So, thoughts?
Yeah,
Anyone?
great. Yeah, this is Sanjay. I think I've got it. I was making kind of the comment about how everything else is treated like code. I think I'll put it this way. You know, to the extent to which, and we've talked about it a lot on this webinar, the extent to which the database is treated separately, differently, and is kind of siloed out of the entire rest of the SDLC is the extent to which you haven't achieved kind of the agility or really kind of claimed victory on DevOps. So I'd say forget the semantics for a minute about treating it as code or not. Really, it's about bringing the database and really the persistence layer into the same unified workflow that you have for the entire rest of the software stack. Like, if we agree that you don't have a functional end user experience until you have both the data and the database plus the application code ready and in production, then the question becomes, why would you go and keep running the entire kind of persistence layer of this in a manual separate process, right? Like that's going to lead to a lot of trouble. And that's precisely what we're seeing is as the application release cycles accelerate, the database is increasingly more and more a friction. And we're fundamentally in the business of helping businesses deliver software more quickly at higher quality and with less risk. And you do that by bringing the database into that same unified pipeline.
Okay.
And I'll say this, I'll go on that with I guess kind of to answer the question with another question. I hate to do that, but if you change it, will it break? Will it break production? I think that's kind of the general thing. So this is a reason why with even infrastructure as code. So I'm a big fan of Terraform. I'm a big fan of Ansible with configuration as code, all these things. Why? Because when people change things and nobody knows about it, it can have severe consequences, like taking production down. If I change a security rule or a firewall port or something like that, guess what? Now we've just lost millions of records. If I drop an index from a table, you say, well, I'm smart enough not to do that. Well, guess what? I know a particular story where a developer also knew better than to do that, but when he dropped the index, he thought he was working on dev, and guess what he was working on? Production. So if we don't start, if the changes we make can't break something and we can do those without consequence, then you're right. Like treating something as code, which is really about having immutable states, having version control, having checks and balances, having quality control. That's really what that means. Then if that can't break anything, then you know what? Go nuts. Then we're probably not ready to have a conversation. But if it breaks something, then we have to slow down to go fast. And sometimes that means being able to put these controls in place, and by result, people actually accelerate and go faster and apps come more. That's the same thing we saw with version control for software, same thing with the same kind of version control for security products and monitoring and so forth. That's right. That's my 2 cents.
Okay, great. Chris, do you have anything you want to chime in, or shall we move on?
I think the guys said it all. Yeah, I mean, it's back to, culture, right? Like we just all have to pay attention to what's going on. We can't just leave one group in the dust. It's all about trying to march forward together.
Okay. All right, great. Next question. If we are going to see an order of magnitude increase in the number of databases to support microservices, how do we scale the security on all these databases?
Man, that's a really good question. And honestly, I think it's one people are still trying to answer. So this goes to the whole elephant for the fleas. Like I do know specific customers where they took that huge monolithic database and spread it into a bunch of atomic data sources. And it's a management nightmare, both from a security standpoint, from a backup standpoint, from a reliability standpoint, a stability standpoint. And it's one of those things that's actually trying to be answered now with some pretty complex tools. So I think what my 2 cents, and I'll quit here, is I think as Kubernetes, I think again, is going to become the de facto platform people build on. Look at Google, look at Amazon, et cetera. They're all running on a form of Kubernetes. But I think you'll see that Kubernetes will also enhance to be able to support these tools and these types of data sources because it's the only way forward. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, this is Sanjay. I think that. Oops, sorry, go for it, Chris.
Yeah, I don't think it's just limited to databases. I mean, even with, there's a lot of vendors out there that are also helping to make sure that, just Kubernetes is also being able to apply the appropriate security, policies that you're trying to dictate. So it's not just databases, it's everything that you're trying to chunk up into little pieces. All that stuff has to be aware of the correct, security posture.
Yeah, and this is Sanjay. I think, it's funny watching the pendulum swing back and forth. You get these very centralized monolithic systems for a while. People decide that's terrible, and then you go back to very decentralized systems. When I look at it, at least in the day and age we're in, there's one very obvious piece to the solution. It might not solve all of it, but it's certainly a start, and that's automation. The only way you're going to get a handle on this is with culture change, process change, but really a core part of it is also having intelligent automation in there to help you manage and enforce all of the security policies that you need. And without automation, you're just not going to be able to scale out to this, beautiful world of serverless or microservices. That is just, you're setting yourself up to fail without automation.
All right, great. Let's see, I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Let's see, which are the most outstanding risks associated with security data and security databases, and how can we mitigate them?
Well, to me, I'll go back to this and touch, since I've mentioned it before, I'll touch it and let it go. And that's the most important thing you can do is not have sensitive data anywhere where it's not absolutely necessary. So it's called, if you're security minded, it's about lowering your attack vectors, right? So if you don't have to worry about, if your non-production environments never have sensitive information, then you can focus on developing security as a product and not having to implement security as a mitigating factor, which allows you to actually move faster. So I can go ahead and try security practices and run pen tests against it, and I don't have to worry about, well, what if in the interim while I'm working on this the next week and a half, somebody hacks that database? Because there's no consequence because the data, there's actually no sensitive data in that place. So being able to eliminate the sensitive data from where it's not actually required to do your functions or jobs, then that's a huge thing you can do to mitigate security risk. I'll let Sanjay or Chris speak to actually securing the database itself.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll echo what I said earlier. A lot of it is, being very rigorous in how database changes flow from dev through to prod. And again, I'll repeat this too. The extent to which humans are reviewing and deploying these changes, you set yourself up for errors. We're bad at doing the same thing over and over and over again. We're not machines. And so the extent to which you can bake these security policies into automation and have intelligent automation check for, whether it's grants or permissions or securely managed credentials or access, these are all kind of the bread and butter steps to protect yourself and to eliminate some of these attack vectors. So that's, at least that's my 2 cents on it.
Yeah, and I think to me, I'm a huge fan of just getting, just doing a full stack security assessment, because it's not just that the database, there's all kinds of gaps all over the place. And, it's before you can even start to do any kind of pen testing, we just have to understand across the board, what does this thing look like? Well, what even are the protection strategies that you have, across all these different layers? Do we even have the right things in place? Maybe there's a bunch of other things that we haven't implemented. So just overall, just go and get an assessment, have some security experts help you across the board, and then, start worrying about, okay, what are the things that we have to implement?
Okay. All right, great.
And a part of
Well,
it really also is baking in a security culture, right? You just have to be security minded, and it takes work to develop and hone a security culture at your organization.
It's everyone's responsibility, right?
Yeah. And sometimes it's funny. Sometimes it's the physical security that can actually allow a hacker to understand what kind of security you actually have on the virtual world. So it has to be across the board, really baked into the culture.
Okay, well, we are at the top of the hour, so I do want to thank our panelists for joining me today. Chris, Adam, Sanjay, thank you all for joining me and giving such a great presentation. I know the audience got a lot out of it, as did I. Also want to remind the audience that today's event has been recorded, so if you missed any of it, you'll be receiving a link via email to the webinar on demand. You'll also be receiving a link to download the ebook that we referenced in today's event, so keep an eye out. The webinar is also going to be living on the DevOps.com website underneath the webinar on demand tab, so just check it out there too if you want. While you're at DevOps.com, check out our other webinars that we have both upcoming and on demand. Hopefully there'll be something there that piques your interest. But for now, thank you all for joining me today. This is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.